Okay, so now that related work's done, let's get to the heart of the system itself. So this is all these diagrams here. So oftentimes systems papers start out with a formative study and design goals. So it's nice to run a short study, even very informally, doing some interviews, analyzing some data, talking to people, observing people at HCI to kind of come up with a motivating context for your system. So here we did a few interviews. Yeah, we conducted some formative interviews with 4 data science instructors. And the idea that the ending of this formative study section is some design goals for your system, right? So you want to set out some design goals. I call them D1, D2, D3, D4, because that gives you some kind of context as to how you're going to describe your system. Because otherwise, if you just dive into your system, people aren't going to know what the purpose of the system is. So this is DSJS, this is Porta. Not all of them need a study, by the way. So here is, this one doesn't have a formative study, which is fine. You could be sufficiently motivated by your related work, right? By the gaps in your related work. This one goes straight into the system. Bespoke, let me see, there's this one. This one goes also straight into the system. And Mallard goes straight into the system. Yeah, so not every paper needs a formative study, but it's nice to have one if you can, if you have time to fit one in. So the system itself, when you describe it, is that you want to use as screenshots if possible, right? You want to have screenshots to kind of highlight things, to talk about your system. It's often hard when you have interactive systems because this is just a static PDF, so it's actually it can be challenging. So making good figures, I think, is important. And the thing I say about your figures is that they should be self-contained as much as possible, and that they should have a caption that describes what's in the figure, so that if someone is scanning through your paper like this, so if someone just goes, again, as a reviewer or reader, scans through your paper, they'll go to a figure, like, okay, what's this figure? I'm just going to read it. Okay, can I get something out of it? Okay, good. I'm going to read this figure. 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 And then, this figure, this figure. Can I get and these tables, can I get a sense of what your paper is about just from scanning through the figures? And the better people can do that, the better off you are. So again, just think about scannability for figures, and don't worry if the information in the caption is redundant with information in your paper, because again, if someone is just skimming over and just looking at the figures, they're going to rely on the caption. So don't have the caption just be one phrase saying, see paper for screenshot details or whatever. Have the caption really describe the figure and make it self-contained. It's okay if the caption is a little long. You don't want it to be too long, right? But it's okay if the caption is 4 or 5 lines. And again, you want them to, DSJS actually has a lot of figures. So you want to walk people through your system using the figures. So in a way, when I write up system sections, I actually just think about making the figures first, or what figures I'm going to make. And then I fill in the text to describe the figures, essentially. So I think it's actually a pretty good way to go, to be figure-centric. Right? So as on these 10 pages, look at all the figures. Just there's a figure on every page. Try to do that if possible in the systems. In the studies, there won't be as many figures, right? Because you're mostly driving a study, but there may be some graphs and tables as well. But for systems, having pictures is very, very, very important. A way I would think about a system section, how you write it up, is that I would just write it up as though you're walking through someone using the system and with the proper details. For example, here for the Mallard system, there is it's 4 steps, right? So the first step is acquire data. Second step is you prototype. Third step is you visualize. Fourth step is you augment the host web page. Notice how these 4 steps are described in the introduction up front: acquire, prototype, visualize, augment. And then when I describe the system itself, lo and behold, step 1, acquire, step 2, prototype, step 3, visualize, step 4, augment. And so that gives it a nice parallelism, because when someone's reading the intro, they're like, okay, this has a 4-step workflow. Great. And then the implementation in the system is, okay, here's how the system achieves this 4-step workflow and what the details are. So that's a way I like to structure it. Let's see if the other systems have this. Yeah, this is not written as explicitly, but it's pretty much the same idea of can you flow from the beginning to the end, right? I mean, this is actually the same idea, right? So activating DSJS, finding tabular data is step one. Step two is appending code editors. And then we're going to go into what this API is. And then live execution, we're running code, we're doing previews, and then selecting data to parse, and then sharing and a URL and such. So that is pretty much for the systems description. Now, a tricky thing about systems is how much detail to write, right? Like on one hand, you want to write enough so that people can reasonably re-implement your system, but it is not, the thing with systems papers is that they are not a user's manual and they're also not a technical spec, right? So you don't want to have too much code related stuff. You don't want to have too much, it's not documentation for your open source project. It's quite tricky to write properly. But the idea is that the one way to think about this is that you want to describe the system to the level of detail someone else can re-implement it. They probably don't have all the details necessary to re-implement it, but you want to highlight the parts that are the most novel and the most they're the most unique. So for example, you don't want to talk about, oh, we have a web page and we're going to let people log in and they're going to create some login information. They're going to reset their password. They're going to, use Google login or whatever login, because that's boring, right? Like no one really cares about that, right? They really care about what is essential to your system in terms of making a novelty argument. So the system section should be fairly straightforward. And a thing that I often like to have at the end of the system section, which I think is really important, I think a lot of stuff's important, but I like to have a section. Here's the systems for Bespoke. I'm losing track because all these papers I read are similar formatting. Okay, so Bespoke system section, design implementation. So I go, and I like at the very end of the system section, I like to write this. I like to have a discussion of the system scope and limitations. This is maybe sometimes in a separate section right after the system. It could be a subsection of the system, but I like to have this right after the system because people are going to read your system. They're like, blah, 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 here's your system. And then as someone is reading through your system section, I guarantee you, if they are a reviewer, they're going to start thinking of limitations. They're like, what about this? What about this? Does it do this? Does it do this? They're going to read. They're like, okay, we're going to really get you because you didn't, your system is limited in this way or in that way, Okay, so they're reading, and then they're like, okay, yeah, this is okay, but clearly it's limited. And then boom, what you do is you hit them right here with the next section or subsection called system scope and limitations. This section is super important. And the reason why is because you're going to admit up front all of the limitations of your system. Well, not up front, right after you describe it. And what the reviewer is going to say is they're going to be like, holy cow, these people really did their homework and thought through the limitations, because no system prototype's going to be perfect, right? They're all obviously going to have limitations. So I really want to scope out exactly what the system can and can't do, what the limitations are, and how we'll deal with it. So this is Bespoke. This is Porta. Where's the system? Right here. Okay, related work. System is right here, starts on this page. So reviewers reading, they're like, okay, yeah, great. System, and then boom, right here, we're going to hit you with a half page system scope and limitations, where we talk about, okay, here's the limitation of the system, here's what it's well suited for, here's what it's not well suited for. This is what really makes it into kind of more a research contribution, because you're really contextualizing it well. You're not just saying, oh, it's like the kitchen sink, it can do this, it can do that, and stuff. So in DSJS, I had it in a subsection right here. So I had a subsection called design discussion, system scope, scale, limitations. Again, the very end of your system, you want to talk about the limitations of the system and what it was meant for and what it was not meant for and such, and limitations. Very important. So I always do this. Let's see, do we have one for Mallard? Yep, right here. Discussion, system scope, and limitations. Right after the system, have a whole scope and limitations. I always call it scope and limitations because I want to say this is the scope of the system. This is what it was meant to do. And I have that right after the system. So very, very important to just have a section or subsection called scope of limitations. Okay, that's it for system.